Why profit rates do not equalise. There's strong evidence that the rate of profit doesn't equalise across different industries. Not only that, but the profit rate tends to be inversely proportional to the capital to labour ratio. Capital intensive industries tend to have a lower rate of profit. Now, why is this surprising to some people? If you really believed in the labour theory of value, this is exactly what you expect to see. If labour is a source of surplus value, industries that employ fewer workers per unit of capital will have a lower rate of profit. But for a long time, economists thought that the rate of return on capital should equalise across all industries. So that when I've pointed out that this isn't the case, people find it surprising and ask me how I explain it. I'm going to give 3 reasons here. One is that fixed capital is immobile. 2 is that the stock market generates an illusory view of what's really happening. And 3, that the effects of capital mobility are not what people expect. The first point is the easiest to understand. Once capital is invested in fixed plant and equipment, it can't be moved. You cannot convert a viaduct into anything else but a viaduct. So industries with a high capital to labour ratio are going to be particularly affected by the immobility of fixed capital. Now, I'm giving railways as an example because railways were the first industry in which this became evident. In the 19th century, Britain and also the United States went through a series of railway booms in which large quantities of capital were invested in the railways and in fixed immobile forms of capital, in rights of way, bridges, stations, etc. Now, did this earn the average rate of profit? Did the rate of profit equalise? No. The average stock market return in Britain from the 1820s to the 1870s was about 9.3%. But the return on railway capital was typically around 4 or 5%. I give the sources for this. Now, Marx was well aware of this. And he said, these capitals, although invested in large productive enterprises, speaking of the railways, yield only large or small amounts of interest, so-called dividends, after all costs have been deducted. In railways, for instance, these do not go, therefore, into levelling the general rate of profit, because they yield a lower than average rate of profit. If they did enter into it, the general rate of profit would fall much lower. Now, he's somewhat arbitrarily saying, I'm not going to include the rate of profit on the railways in the average rate of profit. Whereas the figure I gave before of 9.3% on the average rate of profit on the stock market in the 19th century included the railway shares. But this isn't something specific to railways. It'll apply to any heavy industry or large-scale infrastructure. In these sectors, the rate of return is going to be low. Now, the stock market generates illusions about this. You have to consider what determines the price of shares. Shares have a nominal value at which they were sold when the company issued them, typically when the company floated. But they'll trade at widely varying prices after that. The rough rule is that the current price of a share is their nominal value times the expected rate of return over the average rate of return. So that if shares have an above average rate of return, the price will rise. If they have a below average rate of return, the price will fall. If the expected rate of return on a £100 Great Western Railway share was 13%, it would sell at £130. If the expected rate of return was 4%, it would sell at £40, assuming 10% is the average on the stock market. But the stock market made all industries seem equal. If, say in 1870, after those railway investment booms, a young gentleman invested £8,000 of his inheritance, buying 200 Great Western Railway nominal £100 shares, he could expect an average income of £800 an annum after that. Enough, for example, to run a decent-sized house, employ 3 or 4 servants. To him, it would seem that the £8,000 would bring in about the same income whichever industry invested it in. And that's because of the movement of stock prices to equalise the rate of return for rentier capitalists like himself. It was of no concern of his how many millions the Great Western Railway had laid out in fixed capital 30 years earlier during the investment boom. All that mattered to him is the return on his money capital, which he'd bought shares with. So there is the illusion that the rate of return equalises, but the rate of return equalises for rentier like him because the stock market adjusts stock prices. The proposed equalisation mechanism that I was taught in my economics degree were that if the profit rate is low in sector A, capital moves out. Now let's for a moment forget the fact that it can't do this in many cases because it's fixed capital. Assume it's all circulating capital and could do that. It moves into a high profit sector B. This will cause shortages in A and excess supply in B. So what happens is that supply and demand cause rising prices for industry A and falling prices for industry B, and this equalises the profit rate. That's the story. Now, I'll show you that when you consider the interaction between sections of the economy, this doesn't work. The simple story is too simple. I'm going to start with a basic, simple reproduction model of the type Marx talks about in Volume 1 of Capital. I'm assuming that you've got 7 million workers. 3 million of them work in Department 1, 3 million Department 2, 4 million in Department 2. And the capital to labour ratio is higher in the Department 1 producing means of production. So that there are 3 million people working there, but 8 million person years worth of means of production. And since we assume only circulating capital, that is cycles through every year. Whereas producing consumer goods, you have 4 million workers and 3 million person years worth of means of production. I'm assuming the wage share is 75% to start off with. And when you work it through, looking at what the wages will be and comparing that with the capital stock, you find that the profit rate is much lower in Department 1 than Department 2 because of the high capital to labour ratio. Now let's see what happens if the textbook story is attempted. Let's assume that 10% of the capital in Sector 1 moves to Sector 2 because of the big difference in the rate of profit. And I'm going to make the most favourable assumption that there is no fixed capital impeding this move. So what happens immediately after this? This is a little complicated, but the first thing to notice is that there is now less capital, highlighted in green, in Department 1. Previously, there were 8 million of constant capital and 3 million, sorry, not 3 million, what was it? 2.25 million in wages. So the total capital investment has gone down. And that capital has been reinvested in Department 2. Now in Department 2, the capital labour ratio is 1:1. So equal quantities of it, of that capital, about 1 million, are invested in constant capital and in variable capital. Now remember, at the end of period 1, the total amount of means of production available at the end of that production period was 11. The total amount of means of consumption was 7. If we look at the new outlay on constant capital, it has gone down. It's no longer 11, it's 10.7125. And what's the effect of that? It means that we've reduced demand for means of production. There's a total of 11 units were produced in the previous period, but in the next period only 10.7 units are being purchased. So that the price to value ratio falls in Department 1, which is what the conventional story says should happen. And it rises in Department 2, which is what the conventional story says should happen. But what the conventional story misses out is that this shortfall in demand in Department 1 means that Department 1 ends up making much less profit. Its profit rate falls from what was 7% to 4.5%. It falls because capital had been laid out to produce means of production which can now no longer be sold, because capital has moved into a branch of industry that requires less means of production. And on the other hand, the actual amount spent on wages has gone up. Only slightly, but it has gone up. Previously, the total amount on wages was 5.25. Now it's gone up to 5.535. What this means is that the rate of exploitation must fall, and the rate of profit in Department 2 rises sharply, because there's excess demand now from workers who are being paid more wages. So, profit rates have become actually more uneven as a result of this. Prices have moved the way the standard theory says they should move, but profit rates have moved in the opposite direction. They've become more uneven, not less uneven. So previously the profit rates were 7 and 17. I've rounded to single figures. Now they're 5 and 21. A much bigger difference, though the average rate of profit has fallen because wages have gone up. But this is the opposite of what the theory says should happen. We're getting a bigger difference in the rate of profit. And this implies there would be a runaway process. You've got positive feedback here. The movement of capital from Department 1 to Department 2 accentuates the difference in the rate of return. This means that the movement will accelerate and you'll get a crisis. But you'll get a crisis for another reason. If you look at the amount of means of consumption, means of production being used, 10.7. The amount of means of production being produced, 9.9. Now that doesn't matter the first year, because you've got leftover stocks from the year before. But it means that the economy is no longer producing enough means of production to continue production in the future. So that once those stocks of means of production are used up, you will get a crisis in both sectors because they run out of key means of production. What this is saying is the textbook mechanism that I was taught when I did my economics degree is not properly thought through. There is no attempt to do a step-by-step analysis of physical and monetary flows over time. And this is true even of people like Andrew Kleeman, who claim to take time into account. But he assumes that the equalization process of the rate of profit occurs instantaneously. He doesn't go into the mechanism by which the equalization is supposed to occur. When you do look at it step by step, you find that the suggested mechanism is unstable due to positive feedback and leads to an inability to continue physical reproduction. So, if it occurred, it would lead to a financial, it would lead to an economic crisis, whether a financial or physical one. And the fact that profit rate equalization doesn't appear to really happen should thus be unsurprising, because the story upon which it was supposed to occur was itself incoherent. It contained internal contradictions. It was theoretically ill-founded.